There is a specific kind of silence that arrives right after someone who hurt you sends that first message again. Not the silence of peace, the silence of your own heartbeat suddenly sounding too loud in your ears, because some part of you, some old and tired part, just lit up like a struck match. And if you are hearing this right now, there is a good chance your hands got a little colder, your chest got a little tighter, and a single thought slid through your mind before you could stop it. What if this time is different? That thought is not weakness. That thought is not stupidity. That thought is a nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do. And by the end of this, you are going to understand why that training happened, why it is not your fault, and why the very fact that they are circling back is not proof of your worth returning to them. It is proof of something else entirely, something colder, something that has almost nothing to do with love, and almost everything to do with control. Let's start with the wound itself, because you cannot understand the return until you understand what the leaving actually did to you. Betrayal by someone avoidant does not feel like a clean break. It feels like a slow leak. One day you are building something, or you believe you are, stacking small moments on top of each other like bricks, and then without a dramatic door slam, without a real explanation, the bricks start disappearing. Warmth turns into distance. Distance turns into silence. Silence turns into a version of them that feels like a stranger wearing a familiar face. And the cruelest part is that you were often the one left holding the emotional labor of trying to name what was happening, while they acted like nothing was happening at all. That gap between your reality and their denial is where a very specific kind of psychological injury lives. It is called a relational injury of invalidation, and it teaches your brain that your own perception cannot be trusted. That is the first wound, not the leaving, the doubting of yourself that the leaving forced onto you. Now, hold that wound gently for a second, because you are going to need to understand it clearly before we go further. When someone repeatedly makes you question your own read of a situation, whether through denial, minimizing, or simply refusing to engage with your emotional reality, your brain does not file that away as, "this person is unreliable." Your brain files it away as, "I am unreliable." This is why so many people who have been betrayed by an avoidant partner walk away not hating that person, but doubting themselves, second-guessing their own gut, apologizing for reactions that were completely reasonable. If that describes you, I want you to actually feel this next sentence, rather than just hear it. Your perception was not broken. It was simply inconvenient for someone who did not want to be seen clearly. So now this person, the one who built that fog around you, the one who left you standing in a room full of unanswered questions, is reaching back out. And here is where we need to slow everything down, because the temptation right now is to skip straight to why are they doing this? And we will get there. But first, we need to talk about what is happening inside you, because that is actually the more important battlefield. The return of an avoidant person activates something ancient in the human brain. Long before modern relationships existed, human survival depended on proximity to protectors, to caregivers, to the people who kept us fed and safe. Our attachment system is not a modern invention. It is a survival mechanism, borrowed from infancy, and applied, often clumsily, to adult love. When someone who once represented safety, or the illusion of safety, disappears and then reappears, your nervous system does not calmly evaluate the situation like a judge reviewing evidence. It reacts like a smoke alarm, sudden, loud, impossible to ignore. That flood of anticipation, that flicker of hope, that stomach drop when their name appears, none of that is your character. That is biology hijacking philosophy. Understanding this distinction matters, because the goal is not to shame yourself for feeling something when they return. The goal is to recognize the feeling for what it is, so it stops making decisions on your behalf. Let's talk about why they left in the first place. Not with excuses, but with clarity, because clarity is the antidote to obsession. Avoidant attachment is not simply a preference for independence. It is a defense architecture built early, often in childhood, around a core belief that closeness eventually leads to disappointment, engulfment, or loss of self. Somewhere in that person's development, intimacy got wired to danger. Maybe love was inconsistent. Maybe emotional needs were met with irritation instead of warmth. Maybe vulnerability was punished rather than protected. And so the child inside that grown adult learned an unconscious rule that has quietly steered every relationship since. Get close enough to receive benefits, but never close enough to be truly needed. Because being truly needed once meant being truly hurt. This is important, and I want you to really absorb it. Their leaving was not a referendum on your value. It was the activation of a threat response that had nothing to do with your worth and everything to do with their history. You did not become unlovable the day they pulled away. You became a trigger. Those are two completely different things, and confusing them is what keeps so many people stuck in cycles of self-blame that were never theirs to carry. But here is where it gets complicated, and here is where we start moving toward the coming back part of this story. Avoidant people do not typically leave because the relationship felt bad. Often they leave right as things start to feel good, because closeness itself becomes the threat. And once they leave, once distance is restored, something strange happens inside their nervous system. The very thing they fled from starts to look appealing again, because from a distance, intimacy is no longer dangerous. It is just an idea. A comfortable, low-risk, emotionally safe idea, because you are not actually in the room asking anything of them. This is the paradox that confuses so many people who have loved an avoidant partner. Why would someone who pulled away suddenly start reaching back? Sometimes gently, sometimes persistently, sometimes with just enough warmth to make your chest ache. The answer lies in what psychologists sometimes describe as a deactivation and reactivation cycle. When someone avoidant is close to you, their deactivating strategies kick in. Emotional withdrawal, nitpicking, sudden focus on your flaws, comparing you unfavorably to some fantasy of freedom. But once the actual closeness is gone, once you are no longer physically or emotionally present, demanding connection, those defenses have nothing left to defend against. And in that empty space, longing creeps back in. Quiet at first, then louder. I want you to notice something here, because it will save you a great deal of pain going forward. Their longing for you, when it appears, is real in the sense that they genuinely feel it. That is not the deception. The deception, if we can even call it that, since it is often unconscious rather than calculated, lies in what that longing actually represents. It is not necessarily a longing for you as a whole, complex, ever-changing human being with needs of your own. It is very often a longing for a feeling. The feeling of being cared for without the exposure that comes from truly caring in return. The feeling of being missed without doing the work of making themselves known. The feeling of comfort without the vulnerability of consistency. This is the part that stings the most, so let's be gentle here while still being honest. When an avoidant person comes back after betrayal, they are frequently not returning to repair what they broke. They are returning to retrieve what they lost. And there is a difference between wanting a person back and wanting a feeling back that happens to be associated with that person. One is rooted in growth. The other is rooted in nostalgia, dressed up as love. So how do you tell the difference between someone who has genuinely changed and someone who is simply feeling the ache of absence and mistaking it for readiness? This is where pattern recognition becomes your greatest form of self-protection, because words are cheap, and an avoidant person in the middle of a reactivation wave will often say exactly what your heart has been starving to hear. But growth is not measured in words. It is measured in the boring, unglamorous, repeated proof of behavior over time. Ask yourself, quietly, without letting hope answer for you, whether this return comes with any acknowledgement of impact. Not a vague, generic apology that centers their own discomfort. Phrases like, I know I hurt you, spoken with more irritation than remorse. But an actual, specific naming of what was done and what it cost you. Avoidant people in genuine repair mode can articulate this. Avoidant people in reactivation mode tend to rush past it, eager to get back to the comfortable feeling and away from the accountability that threatens their defenses. Ask yourself whether there is any evidence of internal work having occurred during the time apart. Not proclamations of change, but signs of actual reflection, therapy, reading, uncomfortable self-confrontation. Or was the time apart simply spent living exactly as they always have? Distracted, distant, avoidant even from their own inner world, until loneliness became loud enough to send them back toward the person who once filled that silence. And ask yourself honestly, what specifically has changed about their capacity for closeness, not their circumstances? A change in circumstances, a breakup with someone else, a slow season at work, a bout of loneliness during a holiday, is not the same as a change in capacity. Someone can be circumstantially available while remaining emotionally identical to the person who hurt you. Circumstance is not character. Here is a metaphor that might help make this feel less abstract. Imagine a tide that pulls away from the shore and then rushes back in. From a distance, it looks dramatic, urgent, even romantic. Water racing back toward land like it cannot bear to be away. But the tide is not choosing the shore out of love. It is responding to gravity, to pressure systems, to forces entirely outside its control. It will rush in, and just as certainly, it will pull back out again. Not because the shore did anything wrong, but because that is simply the nature of tides. An avoidant person's return can feel exactly like that rushing tide. Powerful, immediate, almost overwhelming in its intensity. But you are not obligated to build your entire emotional coastline around a pattern that was never promising permanence in the first place. Now let's talk about you, because this entire conversation is ultimately about you, not them. What does it do to a person to be betrayed and then quietly, persistently pursued afterward? There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being both discarded and desired by the same person, sometimes in the same conversation. It creates a disorienting hunger for resolution, an ache to finally understand what happened, to finally receive the explanation that never came the first time. This hunger is completely human. It is also, unfortunately, exactly the kind of hunger that an avoidant person's return can exploit without even meaning to, because the promise of finally being understood is one of the most powerful lures the human heart responds to. I want to validate something here, because it deserves to be said plainly. If you have felt confused about why you still feel pulled towards someone who hurt you, that confusion does not mean you lack self-respect. It means you are a person with a nervous system that formed real attachment, and real attachment does not evaporate simply because someone behaved badly. Attachment and respect are not the same system. You can still feel pulled towards someone your logical mind has already judged unworthy of your trust. That contradiction is not a character flaw. It is the human condition, and recognizing it without shame is the first step toward not being ruled by it. Let's go deeper into the psychology of why their return can feel so intoxicating, because understanding the mechanism robs it of its power. There is a concept sometimes called intermittent reinforcement, borrowed from behavioral psychology, that explains why unpredictable rewards create stronger cravings than consistent ones. If someone gave you warmth every single day without fail, your brain would register it pleasantly but predictably. But when warmth is unpredictable, when it disappears and then reappears without warning, your brain treats every reappearance as a small jackpot. This is the same mechanism that makes certain games and unpredictable rewards so compelling, and it is not a coincidence that it also explains why the return of an inconsistent partner can feel almost euphoric, even when your rational mind knows better. This means the intensity of your longing is not a reliable measure of how good this relationship actually was or could be. It is often simply a measure of how unpredictable it was. The more chaotic the availability, the more addictive the craving. So, when you feel a surge of excitement at their return, that surge is not necessarily telling you this is right. It might simply be telling you this was unpredictable, and unpredictability hijacks the reward system. Separating those two signals, the emotional surge and the actual evidence of safety, is one of the most powerful skills you can develop right now. Let's talk about self worth, because this is where the deepest healing actually happens, far below the surface level question of whether to respond to them or not. Somewhere along the way, many people who have loved an avoidant partner absorb a quiet, corrosive belief that closeness has to be earned through enough patience, enough understanding, enough shrinking of your own needs. This belief usually did not start in this relationship. It usually started earlier, in childhood dynamics, where love felt conditional, where affection had to be chased rather than simply received. An avoidant partner does not create this wound from nothing. They often, unfortunately, fit perfectly into a wound that was already there, like a key that happens to match a lock that was carved long before they arrived. This is worth sitting with. If their distance felt strangely familiar, if their inconsistency felt oddly like home, that familiarity is not a sign that you are meant to be together. It is a sign that your nervous system recognized a pattern from earlier in your life, and recognized patterns feel like destiny, even when they are actually just repetition. Breaking this cycle does not require you to hate them. It requires you to become suspicious of the word familiar, and to start asking whether familiar and healthy are actually the same thing, because very often they are not. Now, let's address the specific emotional terrain of betrayal itself, because it deserves its own careful attention, rather than being lumped in with ordinary heartbreak. Betrayal creates something psychologists sometimes call a shattered assumptive world. Before the betrayal, you likely operated on certain assumptions: that the person choosing to be close to you was choosing you honestly, that their affection, even if imperfect, was at least sincere in the moment it was given. Betrayal does not just hurt in the present tense, it reaches backward and recolors the past, forcing you to wonder which moments were real and which were performance. This retroactive questioning is exhausting in a way that ordinary grief is not, because grief mourns a loss, while betrayal grief mourns a loss and interrogates a memory at the same time. This is why betrayal by an avoidant partner can feel uniquely disorienting. Avoidant people often withdraw gradually rather than announce their exit, which means the betrayal itself can be foggy, difficult to point to, difficult to explain to anyone else without sounding like you are overreacting to nothing. You might have felt crazy trying to describe what was happening to friends, because on paper, nothing dramatic occurred. No one said cruel words directly. No single moment can be pointed to as the wound. But the absence of drama does not mean the absence of harm. Slow abandonment is still abandonment. Quiet betrayal is still betrayal. You do not need a dramatic story to justify your pain. Let's talk now about what happens in your body during all of this, because psychology does not live only in thoughts, it lives in physiology too. When someone who caused this kind of injury reappears, your body often responds before your mind has time to catch up. A tightening in the chest, a subtle nausea, restlessness that makes sitting still feel unbearable. Some people notice their sleep becomes lighter, more fragmented, as if some part of them is standing guard again, waiting for the next unpredictable move. This is not overreaction. This is a nervous system that has learned through direct experience that this particular person represents unpredictability. And unpredictability, to a nervous system built for survival, reads as danger, regardless of how gentle the words being spoken currently are. Understanding this physiological reality matters because it gives you permission to slow down before responding to their return. Your body needs time to recognize that the alarm bells ringing are old alarm bells, echoes of a real injury, not necessarily an accurate forecast of present danger, but also not something to be dismissed either. The goal is not to silence your body's signals. The goal is to listen to them without letting them make split-second decisions for you. Let's revisit the question of why avoidant people return after betrayal, because there is another layer worth exploring, one that is less about longing and more about identity. For many avoidant individuals, being loved by someone, having someone willing to stay despite distance, despite inconsistency, despite hurt, becomes a quiet form of proof. Proof that they are still lovable, despite the parts of themselves they find hardest to accept. Your continued presence, or even your continued emotional reaction to them, however painful, can function almost like evidence in a case they are unconsciously building against their own deepest fear, the fear that they are fundamentally too difficult to love. When they return, sometimes what they are seeking is not intimacy with you specifically, but confirmation that the door is still open. Because a door that remains open soothes their anxiety, even if they have no genuine intention of walking through it fully. This is one of the most important distinctions to understand. Some avoidant returns are attempts at repair, others are attempts at regulation, a way of soothing their own anxious feelings about loss by testing whether they still have access to you, without any real plan to change the dynamics that caused the original harm. The tragedy is that these two motivations can look almost identical from the outside. Both might include a heartfelt sounding message. Both might include an apology. The difference reveals itself only in what happens after you respond, in whether the warmth continues to build or whether it quietly recedes again once your reassurance has done its soothing work. So what do you do with all of this? Not as a checklist, but as a way of being. The first and most important shift is moving from asking, do they still want me, to asking, does their behavior, historically and currently, make me feel safe enough to be fully myself? That single reframe changes everything, because it moves the center of gravity away from their intentions, which you cannot control or verify, and toward your own observable experience, which you can trust. Let's talk about boundaries, not as walls, but as clarity. A boundary is not punishment. It is not a way of making someone suffer for what they did. A boundary is simply an honest statement of what you can and cannot tolerate, communicated so clearly that there is no ambiguity left for confusion to hide inside. Many people who have loved an avoidant partner struggle with boundaries because avoidant dynamics thrive in ambiguity. Vague promises, undefined relationships, hints instead of statements. Learning to speak plainly, even when your voice shakes while doing it, is one of the most powerful acts of self-respect available to you right now. There is a particular kind of courage required here, because stating a boundary to someone who has already shown a pattern of disappearing means accepting the possibility that they might disappear again in response to that boundary. This is terrifying, and it is also incredibly clarifying, because someone who leaves the moment you ask for honesty or consistency was never actually offering you either of those things to begin with. Their departure in response to a reasonable boundary is not a tragedy. It is information, delivered quickly and painlessly compared to the alternative of discovering that information slowly, over months or years, after investing even more of yourself. Let's talk about grief, because underneath all of this analysis, there is simply grief, and grief deserves acknowledgement rather than only strategy. You are allowed to grieve the version of this person you believed existed, even while intellectually understanding that version may never have been fully real. Grieving a fantasy is still grief. It still deserves tears, still deserves patience, still deserves gentleness, rather than the harsh self-criticism of why am I still sad about someone who hurt me. Healing does not require you to stop caring instantly. It requires you to keep choosing yourself, again and again, even while the caring is still present, until one day the caring naturally quiets on its own timeline, rather than one you force. Here is a metaphor that might land differently than the tide one earlier. Picture a house you used to live in, a house with a room you loved deeply, and imagine that house burning down, not all at once, but slowly, room by room, until only the frame remains. Now imagine someone hands you a photograph of that house as it once was, warm light in the windows, and asks if you would like to move back in. The photograph is real. The warmth in it once existed. But the house in the photograph no longer exists in that form, and moving back in means moving into ash and structural damage, not into the picture. Longing for the picture is natural. Mistaking the picture for the current structure is what causes people to walk back into buildings that can no longer hold their weight. Let's talk now about hope, because hope is not the enemy here, despite how this conversation might sound. Hope is a beautiful, necessary human capacity. The danger is not hope itself, but misplaced hope. Hope invested in a version of someone that has not yet been proven to exist outside of your own imagination and their momentary words. There is a difference between hoping someone can change and believing they already have, based on nothing more than the fact that they said something you desperately wanted to hear. Healthy hope waits for evidence. Desperate hope creates evidence out of thin air, filling in blanks with the most generous possible interpretation, because the alternative, sitting with disappointment, feels unbearable. One of the most freeing realizations available to you right now is this. You do not have to decide today whether they have changed. You do not have to make a permanent decision under the pressure of their sudden reappearance. Time itself is one of the most reliable diagnostic tools in existence, and it costs you nothing to simply watch from a safe emotional distance, whether their actions over an extended period actually match the story their words are currently telling. Real change reveals itself patiently. It does not need to be rushed, and anyone genuinely committed to repair will not resent you for taking the time to see it proven rather than simply promised. Let's address something that often goes unspoken. The shame that can accompany still feeling something for someone who hurt you. So many people silently punish themselves for this, treating their own lingering feelings as evidence of weakness or poor judgment. I want to be very direct here. Feeling something is not the same as acting on it. You are allowed to feel longing and still choose differently than that longing suggests. In fact, that exact choice, feeling the pull and consciously not following it, is one of the strongest demonstrations of psychological strength a person can show, far stronger than the fantasy of feeling nothing at all. Numbness is not maturity. Conscious restraint in the face of real feeling is maturity. Let's return to the avoidant mind for a moment, because understanding their internal experience more deeply can dissolve some of the mystery that keeps people stuck in analysis loops. Avoidant individuals often experience a strange internal split when a relationship ends, especially one they themselves ended or damaged through withdrawal. Part of them feels genuine relief, the nervous system finally released from the pressure of closeness. But another part, often delayed, sometimes by weeks or months, begins to experience what could be called idealization in retrospect. Once you are no longer physically present, once the demands of real intimacy are gone, their mind is free to construct a version of you that requires nothing and gives everything, a version shaped more by imagination than memory. This idealized version is seductive to them precisely because it is safe. It cannot ask questions. It cannot express hurt. It cannot demand accountability. And so, when they reach back out, they are sometimes not reaching toward you as you actually are now, complicated, wiser, perhaps more guarded, perhaps still healing. They are reaching toward the frozen, idealized memory their mind constructed during the silence. This is why so many people report a strange experience when reconnecting with an avoidant ex, a sense that the person seems to want a version of them that no longer quite fits, a version from before the pain, before the growth, before the boundaries that experience rightfully built.